Okay. So now we've kind of set the stage, and I guess my first question to all of you, and maybe we can start here, has to do with balance, because I think that the reason we've been doing this initiative called Measuring What Matters is out of a sense that because of the narrow things we've been measuring in education, we've kind of narrowed our definition of education and narrowed because it's driven policy and funding and the pressure on schools, it's narrowed what happens in schools. But on the other hand, there's the reality of a desire, the importance of education telling the world what it does. And finding a way to report to the world, these are the important things that we're working on. And it's important that, I run a nonprofit. I have to set goals. I have to figure out how to measure how we're doing getting towards those goals. So how do we get a balance between the incredibly important things that Ian described, and I think that I hope we all agree on, that the complexity and the amazing work that happens inside classrooms, that ongoing, continual assessment that is for learning. How do we have a balance between that and a public desire to know and understand what's going on in the education system? And, the Alberta Teachers Association talks about intelligent accountability, and mostly we have very deeply not intelligent accountability right now, probably. And we've kind of driven the system that way. We love the simplistic, and I always use this, the up good, down bad graph. Great. Got the proxy measure. No, somebody declared it a national emergency 2 years ago in math because our PISA scores, our rank went down by 2 points. But how do we get that balance between valuing and understanding the importance of what happens inside classrooms, the importance of that for students, for educators, for all of us, as everybody said this morning, and a public's desire to know and how important it is for the education world to tell the public what we're doing? Sorry, very long question. Go ahead, Sam.
And a difficult one to answer as well. Look, I think we undertake assessment for different audiences and for different purposes. No one type of assessment is going to satisfy all of those audiences or meet all of those purposes. So I think a balance is a matter of having an ecology of assessment where we're not giving too much emphasis to one over the other, and where we have the types of assessment that we need for various audiences. So, the education minister is going to need some numbers. He will be just as affected by the narratives of individual success or that aha moment that changed a student's educational career. But when he meets with his colleagues in Treasury, he's going to need to say we're doing the right thing or not on the basis
of...
Or she, sorry. My apologies. I'm thinking of a particular individual. But that doesn't mean that the really exciting and interesting sorts of assessment work that I heard a lot about this morning shouldn't also be happening in parallel with that, and we should have structures that enable that.
So I want to say one of the things that I think is important is that we not underestimate the academic importance, though. And since EQAO has come into origin, we do have more students who are able to read and write, and we have seen definite growth in that area. And the funding went to that area because we understood that there was a challenge for us. Having said that, in everything I think that we now do in EQAO assessments is we put on our website that they do not tell the complete story. They tell a slice. And the most important thing then that in our communications is we work through our media relations, the forum that we do where we invite educators and others to come in and then profile it to trustee organizations around schools where they're using evidence-informed decision-making that values the piece that EQAO gives them, but then looks at all other different factors as well. So when I talked about the work that I did in Limestone, and I have to tell you, I'm really proud of how many students have better futures because their academic piece of it wasn't holding them up. It wasn't a barrier. But it wasn't just EQAO we looked at, and so we valued things like we participated in a private survey system to find out about students, how socially engaged they were, what was their connection to adults. And I think the more that we can change the narrative so that it's not that polarizing of disaster when the results come out, and EQAO needs to think about that as well. We've had those conversations about how we report out, and are there ways that we can report out that meet the accountability mandate, but at the same time continue to recognize that we try to create that narrative of it is a slice with other pieces, and also looking at the more the attitudinal type approach as well, not just the academic achievement.
Before you answer, Ian, I want to push a little bit harder here. Just because of the balance piece, two parts to it. It seems to me, even in Limestone, you could have got the same information by looking at what your students were doing in Limestone. So that's one question, because is it necessary to test every single student in the province in order to understand what's happening in your board? And the second piece goes to when you're thinking at EQAO and you're new modernizing EQAO, however you say it, how do you think about how to achieve a better balance? Because I personally, this is me personally, not evidence-based, Annie Kidder running a research organization, I find it horrifying when I hear that there are kids in grade 10 being prepared to write the literacy test, because it's not that hard, actually, for one thing. So that actually classes do stop to prepare for EQAO tests. So part of it is the balance piece, and is it necessary to test every single student?
So if we want to be just about accountability, then it's not necessary to test every student. In my opinion, from the point of view, if we just want that big, how's Ontario doing generally, that's what the international assessments give us to some extent. So for me, as an educator, the importance of evaluating every student was actually about student success and equity, because it created conversations and questions for us about patterns over time and trends over time, and why was that happening. And we had a large enough data set because it was every student, and we could also then start to map out, depending on certain things that occurred in groups of students, we then understood what our intervention needed to be. And so if we didn't have that for every child, we wouldn't have been able to make the decisions that we made with confidence. We also did a lot of innovative things. And EQAO was an opportunity for us then to report out at the end of it and say, okay, there wasn't any bias, because sometimes we get really enthusiastic about the work that we're doing in the classroom, and so then people who are cynical might say, oh, well, you were just really keen about that teaching strategy that you were doing and the work that was involved. And EQAO provide then that sense for us to work with other educators to grow some of those instructional strategies that we were looking at, in particular in mathematics. So that's my response to that part. And the second question, Annie?
Let's move on to,
okay.
We'll keep going for a second. Go ahead, Ian.
So
in terms of the balance.
Yeah, let me just pick up on the balance piece then. So just to underscore a few things, I think, in my remarks, is the idea of in the classroom, in the moment decisions that are made around the assessment decisions that are made, those sort of micro decisions. It would be the equivalent, for instance, of saying, a meteorologist saying to us, well, it's raining over Lake Ontario, but someone who is actually in a sailboat looks at that and goes, you know what, the swells have increased by a foot in the last 2 minutes. I think we're going to go this way to this harbor, this safe harbor, but this is a different place to go. The other piece around balance is that it's the disproportionate emphasis. So we can talk about the intended purpose of EQAO, and then the gap between that and the unintended consequences. And I've tried to be fair. I mean, that's why I think I'm using the EQAO Twitter, the tweet. That's an explicit acknowledgement from the office. That you ask teachers how your students are doing, not just those EQAO.
So how could the system then? How could we what kinds of ways, in that balanced way, could the system be reporting on how it's doing?
So again, we already have that evidence and some of that data that comes in. I prefer the word evidence, but in the form of provincial report cards, right? Those are opportunities also in formal settings to be able to share that in teacher-parent interviews, the opportunity outside of those to connect as well. So we already have that evidence or that data that we could speak to, and it would be beyond also literacy and numeracy.
Okay, well, so then following up on that and thinking about what Jean talked about this morning and what Kelly and Nancy's panel talked about and what I think the whole world is talking about, which is that even though I always feel like I have to acknowledge reading, writing, and math are very important, nobody's saying they aren't, but that the whole world is saying there are all these other competencies actually which underlie, which are the foundation for being able to keep on learning, be able to change jobs multiple times, be able to take care of your mental health, not just your mental illness when you get there, understand yourself, have strong citizenship skills. So we have a whole world that's looking at global competencies, whatever we're calling them, 21st century skills, everybody has a different name, and a desire to know, back to the big thing, how are our education systems doing in terms of building those competencies and skills in our students. I'd like to hear about the dangers and the possibilities of now we're going to have to figure out a new simplistic way to test those things, or are there ways to actually understand at a jurisdictional level, balanced with the absolutely vital work inside classrooms in terms of those other areas? Start here, sir.
Well, I mean, I think, of course, there is a risk, and I think it's a worthwhile experiment to expand what's tested in order to push back against the tendency to narrow the curriculum if we only test certain things. But it can have the same unintended consequences, of course, in relation to those newly measured domains. I think what is important is to kind of have a more sophisticated discussion about the data based on the distinction I made between data being rhetorical and data being factual. Just because we have data on something doesn't mean we yet know exactly what the situation is. We have to make an interpretation of those data. And I think teacher professional knowledge, for example, is a very important part of making that interpretation. If we just treat the data as facts, then I think we're still at kind of, assessment 1.0, and a more balanced version would actually treat the data as the beginning point for a conversation rather than the end of the conversation.